It's my pleasure to moderate the panel today. I'm Christine Survey. I'm a former principal, and I've been in principal prep for 12 years. So I have a pretty good appreciation of Shelby's message today, and hope everybody appreciated it as much as I did. I thought she had some incredible insights for us. So now we're going to let her add to that with our panel, and then hopefully, time permitting, we'll do some Q&A here as well. One of the things I'll ask you to reconsider as the panel addresses questions today is that impact on student learning. So going back to Shelby's points on goal setting and planning, promoting and participating in teacher learning, and planning and coordinating teacher evaluation. And we did a sort of practice panel, and I heard all three of those. So I'm not going to be surprised at all that that impact area is going to come up in the responses. So let me first of all just go down the row here and have each of them introduce themselves. You do have a bio in your handouts about their background, so you can go much deeper and look at some contact information if you wish. Okay? Alan?
I'm Alan Mather, the principal of Lindblom Math and Science Academy, a 7th through 12th grade selective enrollment school in the Chicago Public Schools.
Can you try passing the mic? Maybe we've got two microphones, so let's see if that works.
Shelby Cosner, you've seen me before.
Hi, Diane Rutledge. You've seen me before too, but again have been in the roles of principal all the way through superintendent, and now with the Large Unit District Association, representing all the large school districts in the state, again continuing to work with leadership issues around the state, and had the good fortune of working with Wallace with all the original leadership work, and so it's fun to be able to apply that now today. Maggie?
Steve introduced me earlier, but I'm Maggie Glendinovi. I'm with New Leaders in Chicago. We train principals around the country, but obviously also here in Illinois.
Okay.
I'm Ben Elfritz. I'm a principal at Brown County School District, which is a rural school district here in Illinois. I've served administrative roles at all levels, high school, middle school, and elementary school, as well as led a lot of district initiatives for professional development and some of those kinds of things.
All right, then if you want to keep that microphone. Here's our first question for the panel. Dr. Costner's presentation focuses on the complex work that affects the principal through not only managing a school building, but also the organizational capacity to improve teaching and learning. We're going to ask Ben and Alan to respond to this one. Tell us some ways that you have worked to build organizational capacity in your school.
One of the things that, we all talk about change, and change is always something that some people do really well with and some don't. So for me, one of the biggest things is understanding that change is pushing people at a rate that they can tolerate, and that's different for every single person in my buildings. But the biggest thing with that is that one of the biggest things to get that to shift was identifying those movers and shakers in your building. Who are those people that no matter what the initiative, they are the first people to sign up for it and just want to see change happening. So by identifying those people, it makes my job as a leader in changing that organization a lot better, going back to the team aspect there. If teachers will always be able to tell other teachers things that I can never say as a principal, and teachers will always be able to get more effective, long-lasting change when they're teaching each other versus if I'm leading out on some of those things. So with that organizational change there, once I found out those people and then I start pouring into making change and creating change within those movers and shakers, that made that process that much easier for it to go downstream. The other thing for me is what Shelby mentioned is informing instructional leadership teams. These teams for me are my true heartbeat of what's happening in my school. And so we meet on a every other week basis. And we have those hard conversations that need to happen in a closed room, and then we leave as a unified front. But again, they can help me disseminate things that I need to get to happen within my school or change to happen because they represent their grade level, their department, whatever it may be, to be able to get that to happen with change to go. So for me personally, identifying those people that are the movers and shakers, and then those team aspects to be able to help me to get to that teacher level were two things that are really important for me.
I'll use this mic on this end.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
And save some.
Okay. Part of the, I'm going to echo a fair amount of that because I don't know what the downstate context is, but in Chicago, at least for many of us, I have a 1,175 student school. There are 3 administrators in the school, department chairs do not do observations. Each of them teaches 5 classes, and so we don't have a lot of people to do that. I think we have 276 observations we need to do this year. Most of them would be 45-minute formal observations with pre-observation conference, post-observation conference, which doesn't leave a lot of time for a lot of other stuff. But at the same time, you do get to see great teachers, and that's a wonderful thing. And targeting them, especially targeting those strongest instructional teachers to lead professional development, not only on those what used to be 3 but is now 2 school days within the school year that we actually can have our whole faculty together, but also throughout the year where we, in our house structure, and we're divided by houses, have those people leading instruction within the houses themselves, or how to lead instruction within the houses themselves. The ILT sometimes focuses on instruction, Shelby was talking about, but right now we're focusing almost completely on standards-based grading. So there are ties, obviously, to instruction on that, on teaching to standards instead of to content, but it just becomes trickier and trickier. The more time that's taken away, you really have to rely on those teacher leaders to take over and lead that change.
For the first time ever, less than half of the public school students in Illinois are white, and more than half, 51% in Illinois, are school children, are children of low income. These are trends that are predicted to continue, which will lead to schools needing to meet the diverse needs of more diverse and low-income students in the coming years. Let's turn this question over to Ben and Alan and Shelby. What strategies do you think it's important for principals to know and experience to be prepared for changing student needs?
Let's start with this one. Oh, independent. The last one. You're the last one. Okay. You take it, Ben.
One of the things for my school, I identify, and I have right at 60% of my students that are identified as poverty. One of the things that I think is big to think about is switching the lens that principals are looking through. There are things that if you haven't been involved in that situation, you will never understand, nor will you be able to get to those people unless you change the lens you're looking through. So, for example, I've had to learn the hard way with poverty. For a lot of my parents and students comes a lot of pride. They don't always see that their lifestyle, or the way that they live, the house they live in, or the way that they raise their child is an issue. So if I go into that with the attitude of already thinking there's something wrong with them, they don't want to be fixed. They don't see the need to be fixed. And a lot of my low-income students also, parents, at least initially for us, they are only going on their experiences in education, which typically were not good. So for us to be able to truly get to those students, changing the lens and understanding from their perspective what that means, we can identify those students all day long, but if we can't get to them and get to the heart of the matter that affects them, change isn't going to happen with those students. So for us, creating those opportunities and trying to stay ahead with our poverty students of even simple things like, we're so technology based, but for them, that is a hard thing for them to do. They don't have internet, maybe can't afford it, they definitely don't have a home computer, and for our district, who is a bring your own device, they're definitely not going to send the one computer they have for their whole household to the school district for their child to use. So thinking about it from the instructional standpoint too, of what do we need to change to really make sure that they are still engaged in the work that we're doing, and just ultimately just to build that trust with them. Once you have that trust, and once they know the school can be different than the experience that they had, I think the world opens up and a lot of doors open up. But until you get to that point and you've changed your lens and have changed some of the process of way you think through things, a lot of that change for a lot of our poverty students are really hard to get to that point. And also just identifying things that are low cost, low risk for them, using the local library. That's a pretty non-invasive place to have a meeting that we can get the same thing accomplished as we can without having to have them walk through the school door. Using our local YMCA, whatever that may be in those community efforts too, have been a big part in us being able to reach a lot of our poverty students, which have a big impact on what happens in school walls every day.
Yeah, I think, so again, a little context. We share about the same number of students on free or reduced lunch, around 2/3. We're 70% African American, 27% Latino. And I think the strategies that have to change as much as anything is what we've done with students of color or students at risk is we moved to a control, compliance, and coercion model of education. And when we are in communities where students are able to vote with their feet on whether they go to school or not, we're going to lose a ton the more we try to control them. So the strategies that I think are most important is helping students see the value and the relevance of what they're learning to their lives. If we don't help them make that connection, if they leave a math class and say, I never know why I would ever use this, or leave a chemistry class and say, this has no purpose, no relevance to what I'm doing, we're going to lose them quickly. So I mean, that is just the simplest thing I think to add is, how do we always put this in a context, that local context of what does this mean for you, where you are, and how can you, as a student, affect change within your community?
So the few things that I would add to that, and I think it in some ways connects to some of the points, in our context in Chicago, many of our students are students of color, and so I think in terms of thinking about what does it mean to teach from a culturally relevant perspective becomes really important as a strategy. That plays out in most of our schools, that adults haven't really thought about what it means to teach from a culturally responsive perspective. Part of that also extends out to saying, how do we create a school context that's accessible to everybody? There are all sorts of things that we do unintentionally in schools that make a school inaccessible to certain parents and families. Basic things like not converting school newsletters into multiple languages so all parents have access to the same information is just an example of that. And I think situated in that notion of a culturally relevant practice is really helping schools see communities for their resources versus their deficits. That, and I think that somewhat builds on what you were saying. I think sometimes we can look at a community and we can say, well, there are these 3 or 4 deficits. But I think if we can flip that around and identify what are the resources that this community and these families and these children bring to us, and how can we better tap into those resources, acknowledge and respect those resources, that becomes really important. The last thing I would say that underscores, it kind of goes back to a point that I made earlier, that to me, when I looked at the research from my student at the University of Chicago, it really focused on students who are vulnerable for transitions. And most of our students who are vulnerable for transitions, you tend to see students whose families have limited resources, are somewhat vulnerable. And again, his research would suggest that it's all about the relationship and how do we work to cultivate. I love what you were saying about it's not about compliance and control. I think we can look at schools and we can see this notion of respect versus control. And if we can really help schools come to understand control as having a lot of limitations and think about how to cultivate mutually respecting environments where adults treat kids with respect and therefore kids treat adults with respect, I think that's very important.
Thank you. And Ben has already taken us to, reminded us of the importance of parents in the role of educating children. So let me address this next question to Maggie, Diane, and Shelby. What can principal preparation programs do to better prepare candidates for working with parents and community organizations? Maggie, you want to start this one?
Certainly. So I think Ben and Alan did hit on a lot of pieces, particularly Ben talking about understanding where the parent's perspective, and Alan making sure that you engage, that you're engaging students in their learning. This all kind of falls under, for us, cultural competence. It's something we look very deeply at, and it's one of our primary concerns, and our primary emphasis in our training program is ensuring that our candidates are competent and able to work in multiple settings. And what we tend to see is that principal candidates will have worked in one type of setting, whether it's mostly Latino, mostly African American, or some kind of, well, we don't have a ton of diverse schools, quite frankly, in Chicago. They're generally pretty segregated. But we feel it's critically important that you are able to work in all settings, and that takes understanding the schools in which you're working, and most importantly, the parents and the students and their experiences. I would say we've leveraged our early childhood work, because really good early childhood work deeply engages parents effectively very early on. And so we try to, I think we get better at this every year, because when we started, we certainly weren't as good at this, thinking you can have the great instructional leader and not worry so much about the parents, but if you don't engage the parents, you're not going to get very far. So putting students in different environments, and there are schools that have, it's really feast or famine, right? Schools that have great parental engagement, possibly too much, and then schools that have nothing. So if you come from a school that has nothing, it's really important for you to see what it can look like. And if you come from a school that has really effective engagement, you need to go in a school where there isn't engagement. And giving them authentic experiences, not just going to a PTA meeting or going to an LSC meeting, whatever acronym works in your region, that you need to be engaged, whether that's following parents and students, really getting deeply engaged with a student who might be more at risk, truancy issues. We really try to immerse our candidates as much as possible in the experiences.
Great. Well, let me just add to that a little bit. I think one of the things that preparation programs can help us do is first the fact of teaching our candidates that they don't have all the answers. And I think sometimes those of us who go into leadership pretty much assume that when there are issues around us, that it's up to us to solve the problem. And we tend to leap to that immediately. One of the things that Ron Heifetz always writes about is the fact that the folks with the problem also have the solution. And so as leaders, I think part of what we can do in this preparation programs, part of what universities can help us do, is help the candidates really understand that part of their skill set needs to be how to reach out and invite response back. Sometimes we tend to get a little defensive when people ask us too many questions. They want to come into the school a little bit more than maybe what we want them to. And the answer is to be able to build those relationships. I oftentimes say if it's got the relationship right and you get the communication right, usually the rest of the problems will start to really help themselves solve themselves out. So I think that about being able to open the doors more and have comfort with that. And that only comes with over a period of time of building that trust. That we as schools need to trust that families coming into us are coming there for good reason and for support, and that they can trust us that we're doing the very best thing for their students. So part of it is giving everyone a seat at the table so that they feel like they have a voice, that they are part of that school community, and that the school is not just inside the four walls of the school, but it is in the community. And so I think as candidates coming into the principalship, it is understanding that there's responsibility to joining in on that community. Not waiting for people to come to you, but going out and becoming a member of whatever the neighborhood organizations are, or whatever organizations really have impact upon your school. The other piece I think that we can teach is the fact that we have these kind of standard, as we said, the traditional ways of engaging families and community, whether it is the PTO meeting or whether it is our newsletters home. Those need to look different today than how they have looked in the past. And I think we can teach those skills. We can teach about how to really talk about student achievement when we're sending home our newsletter, not just a list of dates of upcoming events or what the holidays are going to be or whatever. It really is about how families can help really support the work that we're doing, and also the same thing with the communities. I'm seeing more and more communities around this state who are joining with their school districts to say, what can we do to help support your work? And that is how they help support families. And so getting schools to really engage with communities around student achievement, not just what are we going to do for the next holiday, so to speak. So again, building the trust, having the communications, giving folks a seat at the table, and actually giving back the work to the folks who are there that really have the issues that we want to be able to solve together. Maggie?
So, and the very last thing that I would add, as as we think about parent engagement, for example, I would go back to the logic model that we had on the screen, and I'm thinking about that one that had 4 elements: leadership, organization, instruction, and student learning. Those are the within-school factors that impact student learning. The parent engagement and the community engagement is a 5th factor, and if you think about that factor, it has impact in 2 areas. It can cultivate organizational resources, and parents can directly shape student engagement by impacting student homework practices, student attendance, things like that. And so partly, from a principal preparation standpoint, I want our candidates to understand why we would want principal or why we would want parent engagement, not that we want it. Again, taking it back into the logic model and understanding not that we're trying to cultivate parent engagement, but what kinds of parent engagement are we trying to cultivate and for what purposes. That, to me, I think becomes really important. In our program at UIC, because all of our students are in a year-long principal residency, there are amazingly rich opportunities for then enacting broad streams of work around cultivating parent engagement in very purposeful ways. But I think partly how that has got strengthened at UIC over the last year to 2 years is that we now pre-assess all of our candidates during their first semester in the program before they move into the residency, so that we understand their strengths and areas of growth related to principal competencies. Almost always our principals are weaker developed in the area of parent and community engagement, primarily because people come into UIC from the role of teacher leader, and they just haven't had access or experience. But with those pre-assessments, then, when a resident is placed in a school, the first thing that happens is that there's we call a PDP, a plan for development, so that if a principal, we want to really strengthen that candidate's experience in the area of community and parent engagement. It's not only signaled as an area of growth, but the mentor principal and the coach really think about work streams over a period of time that allow deep and meaningful work in that area. So it moves away from episodic experience. Oh, I want you to sit in on this parent meeting today, or I want you to plan the orientation or the open house event, to really thinking about streams of work enacted over a deep period of time that are very purposeful for cultivating particular kinds of parent and community engagement.
And as we start to appreciate the depth of some of these responses, it all goes back to new rules and regulations around principal prep. One of those areas really emphasizes the understanding and appreciation of early childhood. And this may be one of our next edges of growth, to use Shelby's language, but I'm going to ask Maggie and Shelby and Ben to address what can principal preparation programs do better to foster alignment with pre-K through 12 systems and ensure high-quality early childhood programming within communities that really gives children the right foundation in which to start. Along with this question would also be, in many ways, convincing those maybe high school candidates that their role in early childhood is an important one. So this is a very new area of understanding, I think, in early childhood in Illinois for many principal prep programs. So let me see, Maggie, Shelby, or Ben, one of you want to start with this one?
I'll start with
early childhood.
Sure. So first of all, I think the early childhood curriculum is critical to training effective leaders for our schools, period. And there's 4 things I would say that we need to do in our prep programs to ensure that our educators are prepared to lead great early childhood programming in their schools. One is the curriculum, the second would be the practice, the third would be making those connections for principals without the ECE background, and the fourth would be making ECE accessible for principals, because much of the training around ECE is targeted more towards teachers or researchers. So making it, because a principal has a million things to do, right? And I'd also state that part of the problem here too is you have very few candidates have a pre-K or kindergarten background. Most of our candidates have middle grades and up. And so you can recruit more try to get some who have that background. But you should really, I would say that all of our programs should have a curriculum that focuses deeply on what good ECE instruction looks like and an understanding of child development. But then you got to put that into practice. Designing projects that allow your candidates to put their learning into action, that's actually modeling best practices of ECE in and of itself, and making those as authentic experiences as possible. As I said earlier, I think you can tie your work very easily if this ties in with the family and community engagement piece. Also, making connections for principals without an ECE background, meaning our middle school candidates or our high school candidates, and making sure they see the value through the push-up of best practices, particularly around family and community engagement, but also around student engagement, because really good early childhood classrooms engage their students in the ways that Alan was referring to before, that we need to for all our high school students as well. And then finally, making ECE accessible for principals. They cannot be experts in everything, and we constantly have to look at this from the perspective of what does a leader need to know on early childhood. How to go into a classroom and observe and understand that good instruction is taking place, how to hire, and as I said, the family and engaging families early on so that kids come to school ready in kindergarten.
So a couple of things with that for me personally is just going back to the value and kind of the early identification of the sooner we can get them in and start building capacity in those early childhood kids, the better off they're going to be from every year on. I mean, I look at kids who have 2 years in our early childhood versus kids that have 1, and their data is remarkably, they're stronger readers. They come to kindergarten way more prepared in almost every single aspect. So getting them in as soon as possible is a huge thing there. And I always laugh to your last point there. If I've heard a high school or middle school principal or teacher say that doesn't apply to us when in reference to early childhood, if I had a nickel every time, I probably could retire and I wouldn't even be here today. But it's frustrating when you think with parenting. I mean, I can't expect my 5 and 6-year-old daughter right now, if I don't teach them about being respectful to adults, respectful in the way they talk, but all of a sudden at 16, they're just going to randomly turn into this respectful speaking 16-year-old. I mean, it's just not going to happen. However, if a high school student or teacher or principal doesn't understand that if we don't do our job in early childhood, their job gets way, way harder for those students who come to them not reading on grade level, not able to do those higher level skills. I mean, it is definitely a big deal. So for us, with the preparation program, just for principals to know where they can even go to get those students identified, to get them started sooner, but also understanding the bigger scheme of things. It's not about coming to school early and playing. It's coming to school as early as possible to build those skills so that by the time they get to high school or as an adult in your community, that was a huge foundation or building block so they could be successful at an older age. So.
Well, I'm going to take a little pause here and take some questions, because I want to ensure that we get some questions in, even though we have a few more questions to ask the panel, okay? So we really make sure we get your voice in this. I want to look over and just make contact with Heather, who is one of our candidates in the North Central program, and she experienced that, going into that early childhood experience, and she was not one of those that said high school people don't have to do that. So I'm proud to say that doesn't always happen. But let's open this up for a few questions. I'll try to gauge the time again so we can come back and do a couple more wrap-up questions. What would you like to ask the panel at this point? Our topics have been diverse students, parents and community, early childhood, and organizational leadership. And keep in mind that it represents that rural district, and then we've got Chicago, of course, and then the leadership aspects in between. Questions? Yes, Lynn.
All right. I liked a lot of what you were saying because it sort of resonated with some research I've done in the past, and I just wanted to get your impression about whether you thought this was part of your framework. Probably is. We were talking about cultural differences and backgrounds and assets, et cetera. And we all know that education is building human capital. Knowledge, skills, capacity, productivity, whatever you want to call it. But one word I had, or term I hadn't heard, but I think might be useful is that social capital. And, the idea of deliberately building into your processes in your school ways to build social capital for students, I think about things about, networks of people, access to resources, access to information that they wouldn't otherwise know was available. And I just wondered if that's part of the thinking in terms of, this holistic view where we have of school leadership. And just wanted to throw that out for some.
Would you like it directed to any single person?
Anybody.
Who would like this one?
I'm happy to talk about it for a second. I think the word social capital becomes very important in schools. I don't often use it in settings like this just because it's not necessarily widely understood and it can sound academic. But the notion of schools as social organizations means that we've got these social networks that can allow information flow. And so we've got to think about schools as places where information can flow from adult to adult and information can flow from adults to students. And the research would suggest that different students have differential access to those sorts of resources. Students from more affluent families have different social networks and have usually the opportunity to have resources flow more easily to them. And so from a school leadership standpoint, really thinking about how to cultivate networks, both adult networks and networks between students or that connect students to adults become really important. And so a lot of what we do at UIC is around creating social networks. But then you've got to think about the purpose of those social networks. What are the resources that you most want to flow? And so having schools think clearly about what resources need to flow to students at what time and when becomes really important. One example related to that is this notion of creating a college-going culture has become really important in high schools. And so, but we have to think about part of what we know about this college-going culture is that we've got lots of students that don't have access to really good college-going information. And so how does the school become a place where the knowledge resource about going to college becomes accessible to every student in that school becomes really important. That's just as an example.
You're making me cry.
One thing I would add to that real quickly, the networking aspect, and I just had the she's here, Jean Buckley, who's part of the Tracy Family Foundation, and they're the biggest business in our town. And one of the things tapping into that networking thing, what the result the school gets is, I think we underestimate sometimes of going out into the community and seeking out those kinds of opportunities. Because of our networking opportunities with a business like DOT, I have over 400 people that volunteer in my school because they allow release time for their employees to be able to come into my school and to be able to do that. Another thing that's happened, you're talking about that college culture, now with them, with their business, the more educated and the higher level of college that these students are able to go to and be successful at affects their business, they can hire great people. So they've helped us facilitate things like our Ready for College, Ready for Work program. That's a set of criteria that if students meet that, they're more employable. That's something they can take to a business or a college and say, I've done community service, my test scores are great, my attendance is great. And then also, she's helped us organize things like college tours. A lot of times access to even go into a college is hard for some of our students because the parents can't get off work to take them, or they wouldn't even know when the days are. But by them, they help us organize a charter bus. The kids have to show up on a school day, get on a bus, and take them to multiple colleges in a school year so they can truly see that. So that network opportunity just with businesses in your community, that for us has just been a huge, huge success.
Outstanding. We're going to come over here with a question, Stephanie.
I wanted to go back, Shelby, to your point this morning about the importance of schools as adult learning organizations as well, and would like you, maybe first, but anybody else who wants to comment, to address what I'm going to call adults, both teachers and certainly parents. I think in many cases community members who may have been affiliated with the school for a long time, their prior learning experiences with an organization that may have been stalled or weak, and the kinds of strategies or approaches that effective school leaders can take in helping engage those adults who may have a very negative view of what constituted a professional learning community experience, etc., or a parent engagement experience, something that felt manipulative or not authentic. How can we help school leaders really sort of gauge, if necessary, adults' prior learning experiences themselves in terms of moving to the model that you're describing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So, just quickly, when a leader goes into a school, one of the things that we're advocating is that they go in doing a pretty serious diagnostic to really understand where the school is at so they can determine the next moves that make the most sense. And part of that is understanding sort of the history of the school from a teacher learning organization standpoint. That different organizations have different histories as it relates to teacher learning, and really understanding that can allow you to think about the next steps that make the most sense for that organization, and not being respectful of that and beginning to do certain things right away can be problematic. I'll give you an example. So a school where there has never been professional reading that teachers have done on their own time. And if I'm a new principal coming in and I'm all about teacher learning, I could say at my first faculty meeting, all right, here's an article, and the next time we meet as a faculty, I want everybody to have read this, and we're going to discuss it. And on the surface, that sounds so lovely, right? Except in a school, if the history has been that we've never done that, and I come in and make that move, it could be highly problematic. And a better thing that might be a better starting point might be at our next faculty meeting, I'm handing out this article, and for the next 40 minutes, it's silent reading time. And we're all going to read the article, because I'm not going to presume that we've got a culture where reading is something that we do sort of offline, but I'm going to expect that my job is to cultivate that culture. So in 18 months from now, the faculty is saying to me, hey Shelby, instead of having us use our 40 minutes of our staff meeting to read this article, could we just read it on our own and come in ready to hit the ground running? But that came from the group because we started to work to cultivate that. So I think having that understanding becomes really important. And going back to what I said earlier about the notion of making sense of things with people, that if we're going to engage in learning, I don't want to start having learning experiences without people understanding why in the world we'd be having these learning experiences, why this seems to be an area that would be fruitful for learning. Do you guys also believe this would be an area that would be fruitful for learning? And do we have an understanding of what we would do as a result of this learning? I think we don't often appreciate that. And when we don't appreciate that, then we do get the stiff arm continuing when we come in as a new leader. And so the more that we can help people to make meaning of it as we're making meaning before we go and do. I wouldn't want to come in and create this brand new teacher learning organization that looks remarkably different without everybody understanding why in the world I might think this would be a useful thing. I've done all sorts of reading on teacher learning and what learning systems look stronger and weaker. If they've never done any of those readings, why would they think that anything that I'm enacting is making sense? So having them start to understand why teacher learning organization is so important long before we start to create the structures that would deliver that become important to me.
If I could just...
I would jump on that one too. Just one of the things I love that Shelby just said is 18 months. Because, we tried to do this so quickly, and I was thinking about when we were moving to standards-based grading, and 2 years ago we looked and saw that some of our students with the lowest GPAs had our highest test scores. Like, what the hell are we doing, right? So it was, we were worrying so much about homework completion and that part of compliance that we were not evaluating whether students grasped the material. So that started a long pattern of exploration. We had math teachers and a human geography teacher who wanted to jump in first. And they piloted this last year, and miraculously, the math scores grew more than any other, and we had more students pass the AP Human Geography test than we'd ever had before, with those teachers who were doing standards-based grading. This year, sent 30 teachers on one day, and except was at the ball, to go to professional development downstate on standards-based grading. And because of that, by the time we get to next year, we're going to be ready to implement this fully. But that was a multi-year process built out of this identification of a problem we had, and just so often we tried to do this so quickly.
If I just real quickly add to that, I think, again, for preparation programs, making sure that part of the curriculum really is around theory of change, so that our leaders really do know how to actually make change happen, and that you aren't just jumping in because it seems like a good idea. And the other piece of that is about adult learning, as Shelby was saying, because as educators, we all feel really good about our knowledge about teaching students. But as principals and leaders in an organization, it's really about how we're helping to teach the other adults in the building. And so being able to really come to the table with those skills already in place is really helpful for affecting these kinds of change from a system perspective. And on what Ellen was saying about having this time and noting that there were a couple teachers who said, I want to do this first, I think the other piece of that is being willing to go with those early adopters, because you'll never get everybody on board from the very beginning, and if you wait for that forever, nothing will ever happen. But when you do have folks give them that support, give them the resources they need to get out there, and soon others will tend to follow.
Perfect. That actually was one of our questions as well for the panel. Just one quick sidebar. My friend Dr. Sanders over here, when she was a principal, experienced cultural change and reaction to it because one of her first days on the job, somebody moved the copy machine in the office, and the staff was all up in arms because this new principal was coming in and making this tremendous change because she moved the copy machine. As it turned out, it was the janitor that moved the copy machine. But it does remind us of how difficulty change can be. I'm going to get a couple more questions in here. We've got the scale right here, and then we'll come down the row. I think it's Joyce.
Yeah, thank you. I pulled together a couple of the strands from things that you've all said. In thinking about the increasing number of kids who are coming from culturally and linguistically and racially diverse families, and our increase in poverty among young kids, and that vulnerability to transitions, Shelby, that you mentioned. Can you all help identify, Shelby and others, help identify what some effective strategies might be for working to integrate sort of the early learning and the elementary system as kids and families are transitioning so that we can better set it up for success?
I'm not sure that I understood the first half of the question, but then I felt like I lost the second half of the question. So if you could restate it, no.
Yeah, no, so how can school leaders, how can school leaders, school principals, set up an environment or create an environment both internally in their building and externally in terms of partnerships perhaps, so that families are transitioning effectively and children from early learning and those experiences into a K-12 setting?
Do I need to jump a little bit
Sure.
to start? Joyce, I'll just begin a little bit from some experiences, and then others may want to build on this. A couple things. One, I think sometimes we always assume pre-K is in the school building, and that's not always the case, that many times we're talking about pre-K in the community. So I think, again, if our principal candidates can think about how the school is connecting with the community and knowing that they're going to have to reach out to be able to do that. The other piece is to help to support some of the assessment that goes on in pre-K and being able to share that then as those students come into our K-12 settings. Because part of what we're doing, and I'll give a little, maybe plug for some of the assessment that happens as well as kids that will happen as they come into kindergarten. But it is the idea that we know a lot about these students and their families. And I think as building principals, if they would reach out and access that information and be able to make that a part of it. And then I think the other piece is how we help our principals actually engage the community as in home visits, and connecting with some of the, just making sure that the people in our schools, our teachers and other folks there are actually part of that neighborhood and that community, because sometimes we all are who we are inside of a school building, but if there's an area that actually is bus to you that is not in your neighborhood, sometimes folks inside the school have never even been to those neighborhoods or really don't understand what the community is and who the folks are and who the leaders are there and how to access and really maximize who the people are that can help us. So I think all those, but mostly reaching out and making those connections and opening the doors.
We're going to go over here. Question.
Yeah, my name is Leonard Sutton. I'm the department chair of Ed Foundations of Leadership at ISU. I want to go back to the cultural response of our practices that we were talking about earlier. At ISU, in our program, we have a couple of courses where we talk about social justice and cultural responsive practices. And our foundations faculty do a fantastic job of creating a space for our students to have this dissonance inside of the classroom, inside of the department. But routinely, they will tell our faculty, well, just like I said earlier today, this is fine here, but when I go out in the community, there's some limits in terms of how I can continue those practices. So here's what we've tried to do in the past 3 or 4 months. our foundations faculty have gone out into the communities and tried to partner with schools to begin a conversation about developing culturally responsive practices. Here's the issue we're finding that's kind of difficult to overcome at this point. A lot of principals that we talk to some degree feel that if you welcome those conversations, it's almost an admission that you have a deficit around race, gender, whatever. We've tried different messages in terms of getting into those spaces and not delivering a product that layers on to what teachers already deal with, because believe me, we know what that is. I was wondering if anybody in the room can talk about a frame in which to say to a school that, hey, we have this thing called culturally responsive practice that you might want to consider in a way that does not make them feel like they're being marked as a deficit institution. We haven't mastered how to do that. We've got 2 schools we're working with right now, but there's a lot more out there I think we can engage. And when we do that, I think we can give some of our candidates those spaces that you're talking about for them to continue to practice.
One of the things that I would say when I look at some of the research that's been done, there are a few people whose names I'll throw out to you that I think are good resources. Brad Coase was a faculty member at Urbana. He's now a professional development director in Madison. George Theo Harris, he's at Syracuse, but he's done some great writing on how we think about leading socially just schools. Those 2 in particular, really, their work resonates with me. Part of what they really talk about is, I don't know if it's a safer, but it's an important place to start, and that is recognizing that every person in a school comes with an identity, and we think about issues of race and social class through that. And doing a lot of introspective work is sort of a starting point, so that before we even think about what does it mean to practice in a socially just way, how do I come to think about my own history and my own identity as being a filter that causes me to see certain things in a certain way. Partly, I think that might get to the issue of when you were saying, boy, this feels almost like a blame, or maybe you didn't use the word blame, but we're creating this context where this feels like a negative, like is our school racist, or and maybe not. That's not it, but to help everybody understand that everybody comes in with a certain perspective that has limitations. And we want to become more introspective in being able to understand that, and understand that how that causes us to do certain things as maybe a starting point. And I don't know whether or not that has been a starting point in the schools, but that notion of everybody doing some self-study as a starting point is something that I pick up from a lot of the reading that I do, and that might be helpful.
And I would just piggyback on that. This is really foundational to our work, I think, and I wouldn't limit it to race, because all of our students come in with, whether it's your sexuality, there's so many ways, just what Shelby was saying, we all have biases, we all come in through our own lens, and I think your best training on equity is really identifying that up front. And we have very tough conversations with our candidates around this at the onset. How do you identify? Who do you identify with? And therefore, what's your perspective? And what are the other perspectives you're not seeing? And I think that self-identification is really critical, and understanding your biases. Everyone has them. And not labeling it good or bad, but just an understanding is the beginning of the conversation that I think you can have without people being defensive, but there will be discomfort because these are topics that people generally steer clear of. But if we steer clear of them, we're really not thinking about our students. And I would, again, push to think about all the ways that kids are diverse and those that might be marginalized, and how do we ensure they aren't.
And I would just add, good for you that you're pushing those courageous conversations.
Well, that's our conversation is not centered on race. It's a lexicon of marginality. The idea is that, look, I used to be a principal, and I would probably be the same way. Well, we don't need this. We got all the time. So I kind of empathize with that. But the issue is, the main thing is, like you were talking about, those practices. We provide this incubator at the university to say, have tough conversations, but how do they begin to diffuse that among their learning communities and be the type of leader that you talked about this morning? That's some very good feedback. Like I said, we got 2 schools we're partnering with right now, and we get cussed out someplace. But we quickly recover and move on to the other place. We'll be fine. Thank you.
Just real quickly on that though, but Lynn, there is that training about how to have difficult conversations, and I think that doesn't always come naturally to us as educators. And so, again, to train for that in the preparation program, I think is helpful too.
And many candidates will tell us they don't want to go into a principalship because they don't want those conflicts and those, difficult conversations. We're very close to the end, and I know some of you will have questions yet that hopefully you will still stay and ask the panelists. One last, in a minute we have last remarks. One of our last questions was 3 out of 4 principals surveyed believe that the job has become too complex. What advice would you have for principal prep programs that we are preparing principals of the future for the complex role? To anybody who would like to take that. Ben?
I guess in very short responses at this point.
2 things that I would say is just build relationships. Relationships are going to be the key for you to create change. Your teachers have to trust your heart. And so when you have to have those tough conversations, you never lose of who you are with that. And just be prepared that this is probably the most interrupted job you'll ever have in your life. That what you have on your schedule doesn't mean that's what you're going to get done, because you're going to get interrupted a ton of times. So just where you spend your time is going to show what you're important, and you have to have people in your life like your secretary that protect the time that you can spend in the classroom and build capacity so they can handle some of those things. You're not interrupted as much.
And I would just say, the principal is not the person who has to do everything. And going back to Shelby's presentation earlier, that an area of growth for most candidates is planning, strategic planning, and goal setting. And if you can get that right on the front end and engage your staff, it is a doable job. It's a very hard job, but it's not just the principal's job.
And to add to that about sharing the leadership, because of the fact, again, one person cannot do it all and shouldn't be doing it all. So it's training up about how to share that, and also understanding that this is a continuum of support. The job is not done at preparation, but again, as a state, we have to think about how we support principals throughout their careers and be able to keep the very best people in those positions.
I think because the job is so complex, it's really important that the things that matter most are the things that we train deeply in. So that would be point number 1. And then echoing the notion of distributed leadership, because the job is complex, we have to think about developing complex leadership systems within schools. And so beyond just thinking about the leadership team, we've really got to think about, if I'm the school principal, what are my strengths, but what are my areas of limitation? And I've got lots of instructional limitations because I didn't teach in all content areas. So it becomes increasingly important that I can identify teachers that have content expertise in areas that I don't. Because if we want to problem find in those areas, I need their expertise to help me to know what to look for.
And big picture, big picture, big picture. How does this all fit into the mission of what you're trying to do, everything you're doing every day? Because some things will fall off because you have to keep that final goal in mind.
Well, was I correct on the quality of the panel?